President Donald Trump exercised his presidential veto authority for the first time during his second term on Tuesday, rejecting two bipartisan measures that had moved quietly through Congress with little public controversy. The vetoes halted legislation related to natural resources and land management, one concerning a long-planned drinking water infrastructure project in Colorado, and the other involving land authority for a Native American tribe in Florida. Although both bills had received support from lawmakers of both major political parties and had passed Congress without significant opposition, the White House announced late Tuesday that the president would not sign them into law. The decision immediately drew attention on Capitol Hill, not only because it marked the first vetoes of Trump's current term, but also because of the political context surrounding the lawmakers and groups connected to the legislation. Presidential vetoes are a routine but consequential part of the legislative process. While presidents frequently threaten to veto bills, the actual use of the veto power often signals deeper disagreements over policy, priorities, or political strategy. In this case, Trump's actions came relatively early in his second term and involved legislation that had not been at the center of major national debates. Historically, first-term vetoes often focus on high-profile legislation such as budget measures or sweeping policy reforms. By contrast, the bills rejected this week were more narrowly focused and addressed regional or community-specific concerns. This contrast contributed to questions among lawmakers and political observers about the broader implications of the president's decision. One of the vetoed measures was legislation introduced by Republican Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado. The bill, known as the Finish the Arkansas Valley Conduit Act, was designed to support long-standing efforts to deliver clean and reliable drinking water to communities in southeastern Colorado. The Arkansas Valley Conduit Project has been under discussion for decades and aims to replace or supplement existing water sources that contain high levels of contaminants, including uranium and other naturally occurring substances. Supporters of the project argue that it is essential for public health and economic stability in rural areas that lack consistent access to safe drinking water. The legislation did not propose new construction initiatives beyond what had already been authorized. Instead, it focused on adjusting repayment terms and administrative requirements tied to federal involvement in the project. Lawmakers backing the bill emphasized that it represented a continuation of earlier federal commitments rather than an expansion of spending. Despite its bipartisan support and relatively narrow scope, Trump vetoed the measure, citing concerns about its cost. In his veto message, the president raised questions about fiscal responsibility and whether the federal government should continue to play a role in financing the pipeline under the proposed terms. While the veto message focused on budgetary considerations, the political backdrop added another layer of complexity. Representative Boebert, long known as a strong supporter of Trump, had recently diverged from the president on a separate issue involving transparency at the Justice Department. Earlier in the year, Boebert was among a small group of House Republicans who joined Democrats in supporting legislation that required the release of files related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The proposal initially faced resistance from Trump, who argued against releasing the documents. However, as support for disclosure grew within the Republican Party, the administration eventually reversed its position. Although Trump did not mention Boebert directly in his veto message, the timing of the decision led some observers to speculate about whether political tensions played a role. Boebert herself suggested that possibility in a public statement, while stopping short of making a definitive accusation. She said she hoped the veto was not motivated by political considerations and emphasized the importance of accountability and transparency in government. In subsequent remarks, she indicated that she intended to continue advocating for the water project and suggested that the issue was far from settled. Other members of Colorado's congressional delegation expressed disappointment with the veto. Republican Representative Jeff Hurd, who co-sponsored the bill, described the decision as a setback for communities that have waited years for improvements to their water infrastructure. Hurd noted that the legislation passed unanimously and argued that it upheld commitments the federal government had already made to the region. He emphasized that the bill did not authorize new construction spending, but instead addressed how existing obligations would be fulfilled. Local officials and water advocates in southeastern Colorado also voiced concern, warning that delays in the project could prolong health risks and economic uncertainty for residents who rely on outdated or contaminated water sources. The second vetoed measure involved land authority for the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. The bill would have granted the tribe greater control over certain portions of its land, a move supporters said was consistent with principles of tribal sovereignty and self-determination. The Miccosukee tribe has long maintained a presence in the Florida Everglades and has engaged in ongoing discussions with federal and state authorities over land use, environmental protection, and economic development. The vetoed legislation aimed to clarify and expand the tribe's authority over specific areas, potentially allowing for improved land management and planning. Republican Representative Carlos Jimenez of Florida sponsored the bill. Jimenez has received Trump's endorsement in past elections and has generally aligned with the president on a range of policy issues. The Miccosukee tribe has been involved in legal challenges against the federal government over an immigration detention facility located in the Everglades. The facility, sometimes referred to by critics as Alligator Alcatraz, has drawn opposition from environmental groups and tribal leaders who argue that it threatens sensitive ecosystems and infringes on tribal land rights. In his veto message to Congress, Trump explicitly referenced the tribe's opposition to the detention center. He wrote that the Miccosukee tribe had actively sought to block immigration policies that he said were supported by voters during his election. This explicit reference set the Florida veto apart from the Colorado decision. While the water pipeline veto focused on fiscal concerns, the tribal lands veto directly addressed a policy dispute unrelated to the specific content of the legislation. As of Wednesday, neither Representative Jimenez nor representatives of the Miccosukee tribe had issued public statements in response to the veto. The absence of immediate comment left unanswered questions about whether lawmakers might attempt to revive the bill or pursue alternative legislative strategies. The White House, when asked whether the vetoes were intended as punishment for political opposition, declined to address the question directly. Instead, officials referred reporters to the president's written explanations accompanying the vetoes. Under the U.S. Constitution, for Republican members in competitive districts, maintaining the support of Trump and his political base may weigh heavily on their decisions. The vetoes highlight the complex relationship between the executive branch and Congress, particularly when policy disagreements intersect with political dynamics. Even legislation that addresses localized or technical issues can become entangled in broader debates over loyalty, policy priorities, and executive authority. For some lawmakers, the decisions serve as a reminder that bipartisan cooperation does not always guarantee presidential approval. For others, the vetoes underscore the challenges of advancing regional projects in a highly polarized political environment. Presidents of both parties have used vetoes strategically throughout U.S. history. Some vetoes are aimed at blocking legislation that conflicts with core policy goals, while others are intended to signal broader political messages. Early-term vetoes can be particularly significant, as they often set the tone for relations between the White House and Congress. In Trump's case, the rejection of two bipartisan bills suggests a willingness to use veto power even on measures that lack widespread controversy. Supporters of the Colorado Water Project and the Florida Tribal Lands Bill are now weighing their options. Lawmakers could attempt to modify the legislation to address the president's concerns, attach similar provisions to future bills, or pursue a veto override if sufficient support can be mobilized. In the meantime, communities affected by the vetoes face uncertainty. Residents in southeastern Colorado continue to rely on water systems that many consider inadequate, while the Miccosukee tribe remains engaged in legal and political disputes over land use and federal policy in the Everglades. As Congress resumes its work in the new year, the vetoes are likely to be cited as examples of the ongoing tensions between legislative initiatives and executive authority, tensions that will shape the policy landscape in the months leading up to the midterm elections.